at the age of, what, 7? She speaks to hundreds of groups. Could I go back and come later? This is really difficult, because I'm going to talk to you about a lot of the things that she's been talking about too. Okay, how I learned to love history, and how I think kids can too. The thing is that when I was, this is true confession time, when I was a child, that kid's age, I hated history. I thought it was very boring. It was all about names and dates and generals and wars and treaties and the Articles of Confederation, and who cares. But as I got older, I discovered that history is really very much about people. And I found that some of these people were really quite interesting, quite fascinating, and I began to write some books about them. I have written about more than 50 books for kids and young adults. The last dozen or so are about interesting people in history. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the books that I've written and give you an idea of the kind of character and the take on these characters that I think will bring kids to understand and appreciate and really enjoy history. So we're going to start with Cleopatra. Does that show up well? It's hard for me to tell. That's the jacket of my book on Cleopatra. My big problem when I wrote this book was that, first of all, there are several problems. One is that nobody really knows that much about Cleopatra. We're not even sure exactly of when she was born. The thing I had trouble with was getting the image of Elizabeth Taylor out of my mind. And the one thing I can tell you that we know about Cleopatra was that she probably didn't have green eyes, although I think it makes a great jacket. And she certainly didn't look like Elizabeth Taylor, nor did Mark Antony probably look like Richard Burton, but you know, it's just the movies. It was fun. What interested me about Elizabeth Taylor, about Cleopatra, was that when she was a young woman, when she was a kid, because we're really going to concentrate on the kids here. When she was a kid, she had a couple of older sisters, and they were her rivals. Her father, she was a daddy's girl, Ptolemy the 12th, and Ptolemy the 12th had already decided that his daughter, Cleopatra the 7th, was going to be the next pharaoh, the next queen of Egypt. In those days, there were lots and lots of Ptolemies. Cleopatra had 2 younger brothers. They were both named Ptolemy. Sort of like George Foreman, the boxer who has 5 sons and named them all George, George first, George second, George third. Well, the Ptolemies did the same thing. So we have Ptolemy the 13th and Ptolemy the 14th and so on, and lots of Cleopatras. But it was her 2 older sisters who were the real rivals, and her job as a young woman was simply to survive and not be killed. The sisters killed each other left and right, as we soon found out, because that's how she eliminated the competition. She was an extremely intelligent woman. Whether she was beautiful or not, we don't know, but she was very intelligent. She was said to be quite charming. She had a beautiful speaking voice. Some of the legends and the myths that we've heard about her are absolutely true. She was delivered to Caesar wrapped up in a roll of bed linens, and apparently made quite an impression on him. Eventually, her reign ended, and she was the last of the pharaohs of Egypt, but she was a fascinating character. This is Catherine of Aragon. This is again, I'm showing you all these book jackets, mostly just to kind of keep my memory going here. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Isabel and Fernando in Spain. And when she reached the age of about 14, as was the custom, her parents sent her off to marry a young prince in England. They knew they'd never see her again. She knew she'd never go home again. 14, you're making your political alliances in Europe, and Catherine is going to go off and marry Prince Arthur, which she did. She'd never seen this kid before. He's 14. They don't speak the same language. They spoke Latin together. It was a very short marriage because Arthur was an unhealthy kind of a guy, and he promptly died. And there she is. What's going to happen to her now? Well, if they send her back to Spain, which they kind of wanted to do, they had to send a very large dowry back with her. Well, we're not going to get rid of the money, so we've got to keep the girl. Let's marry her to Arthur's younger brother, Henry. Well, Henry's several years younger, but he was amenable to the situation, and they did marry. It was not a particularly good marriage. The main problem was that, of course, her main job, now that she's with Henry, is to produce the next heir to the throne, to the English throne. And she had miscarriage after stillbirth, after just nothing happening at all, but she had a daughter. The daughter's name was Mary. Henry was not at all thrilled with the idea of having a daughter. He needed a son. I must have a son. And he declared Mary a bastard. She was illegitimate. He wanted to get rid of her mother. And so the thing you do is you decide that the child is illegitimate and the marriage is invalid. I remember one time giving a talk about this book in Las Vegas, Nevada. I was called there by a group, I think they were reading teachers, and they were going to be selling my book about Mary, the daughter. So she comes up next. There's Mary. And there's one scene I took great relish in writing, and it was the scene in which Henry has denounced his daughter Mary as a bastard. And she takes exception to this, and she stands up on a balcony as he's riding away on his horse with Anne Boleyn, who was very much on the scene by then. And she shouts after him, "I am not a bastard." Well, they pulled my book from the book fair in Las Vegas. You can't say bastard in Las Vegas, Nevada. Just keep that in mind should the occasion ever arise. Mary did not have a happy time of it because by then her father, Henry, was much in love with Anne Boleyn, who was going to give him the son that he wanted. And so Catherine is divorced. You remember all that scene with the Pope and so forth, and Henry declares himself the head of the church. He is with Anne for a long time. She is the original tease. We were always accused of being teases when we were in high school, at least back in my day. Girls were. But she really was. It went on for about 6 years. And finally she played the sex card. And she got pregnant. And she had a daughter, Elizabeth. Well, this did not please Henry. Henry decided she was probably an adulteress, and he had her beheaded. So let's see. There's Anne. Poor Anne. Doomed Queen Anne. She did not last long. But she was extremely ambitious. She wanted to be the Queen of England, and she did everything she could think. She played every game she could, and in the end, she lost her head. Well, okay, we're moving along here to, who's up? We have Mary waiting there. There's Elizabeth. Okay, but now Elizabeth is not faring particularly well either. Henry has, in the meantime, married wife number 3, Jane Seymour. Jane was more obliging. Jane produced a son, Edward. Promptly died in childbirth. Lucky she, at least she didn't have to be assassinated or executed or beheaded. Edward grew up to the age of 16. Henry, in the meantime, had 3 more wives. I would like you to consider a moment what is going on in the mind of Mrs. Henry VIII, number 5, number 6. What were they thinking? I was talking to a group of 7th graders one time, and I guess it was a school in Texas, and I was trying to set up my presentation of Mary. And I was talking about Henry. Now this took place about 15 years ago, so you have to make allowance for the lapse of time here. And I was explaining to these 7th graders that, where am I going with this? That Henry, no, I didn't mention Henry. I said, imagine this guy. He's very tall. He's over 6 feet tall. He's a big, muscular man. He's very athletic. He's very handsome. He's very smart. He's really, really rich. But when he doesn't like his wives, he gets rid of them. He has them killed. Anybody know here who know who I'm talking about? Old 7th grade guy raises his hand, jumps up and says, O.J. Simpson! Okay. okay? But we got the history lesson worked out pretty soon. Meanwhile, we have Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a master of manipulation and played a waiting game. Because first of all, you had to have young Edward die of some disease, whatever he died of in that century, in the 16th century. Edward died. Mary managed to ride onto the scene. Whoever expected her to come back, the bastard herself comes back and becomes queen, ruled, was a very unhappy woman. And to everyone's kind of surprise, when she died, Elizabeth, who had been imprisoned and kind of hanging on and thinking, well, you know, when's the end going to come for me? She comes to the throne and lasts a very, very long time. Okay, before we leave the Tudors and move on, let's see, we've got meanwhile, another strand is added to the story. And that is Catherine de Medici. Now, how's she going to come into all this? Catherine is off in Florence. She is not royalty. She is very rich. She's the richest young woman in Italy at the time. But her parents have died. She's an orphan. She lives with some aunts and uncles for a while. They shut her up in a convent for years. And finally, her uncle, the Pope Clement VII, takes her to live with him in Rome. And then he did what all the old rulers did. He looks for a husband for her. She, meanwhile, has unfortunately fallen in love with her cousin Ippolito. Well, we got to get rid of him. So we make him a priest. That takes him out of the running. And pack her onto a ship and send her off to France to marry the Dauphin. And off she goes. Her nickname is Duchessina, Little Duchess. So she gets to France, meets the guy the night before she marries him. And he seems okay, except he is profoundly bored by the very thoughts of being married to her because he has a mistress. And the mistress is Diane de Poitiers. She is old enough to be his mother, and she has been his mistress since he was about 14, and he's not going to give her up. Well, Diane was a very smart woman and realized that if he didn't occasionally visit his wife's bed and produce an heir to the French throne, he was going to be in trouble. And so would she. She would lose her status. So at the mistress's urging, Catherine de Medici finally has conjugal relations with her husband and produces the first of, wow, they finally figured it out, 10 children. 10 children. And so she's really done her job. But in the meantime now, we've got to get the Dauphin a wife. Mary, Queen of Scots, comes onto the scene. Across the English Channel, there in Scotland, is Mary, whose father has died when she was 6 years old. And he dies distraught and unhappy because he has no legitimate heir to the throne. He, too, has a bunch of bastards. None of them can inherit the throne. So Mary's mother reigns as her regent until she's 6 years old, sends her to France, where she's going to marry the little Dauphin, whom Catherine de Medici finally managed to produce. So now she's got Catherine de Medici as a mother-in-law. Not good, not good. Mary, she changed her name to Marie. She learned to speak French. She became part of the French court. She was tall, and by the standards of the day, she was very elegant and very, very beautiful. And here's this wimpy little Dauphin with a runny nose and roomy eyes, and they really look silly dancing together. But nevertheless, they are married, and the first thing you know, the Dauphin becomes king. The father dies, the Dauphin becomes king, Mary becomes Queen of France, and she's got this mother-in-law who's determined to run the show. And that is a very unhappy situation for her, particularly when the runny-nosed little guy dies by the time he's 20, And there's Mary. State is completely gone. She cannot rule France. The Salic law there prevents a woman from inheriting the French throne. And she decides to exercise her rights and go back to Scotland and take over as the Queen of Scotland. Then she makes two of the worst marital decisions in history. I've made some dumb ones myself, but hers are really bad. The first one she marries is Lord Darnley. And Lord Darnley he was tall. I mean, why else would you marry? She finally found somebody as tall as she was. Married him. He promptly went off and visited prostitutes and contracted social diseases, and terrible things happened. She did have a son by him, before somebody blew him up. We still don't know who. But possibly it was husband number 2, who was James Hepburn, the Duke of something. Bothwell. Okay, he was Bothwell. He was short though, but nevertheless. Nevertheless, she has her child, but she can't handle these Scots. They are a rivalrous, bloody bunch, and they're always trying to off each other. And finally, she flees. But you know, nobody has ever figured out what happened exactly to Lord Darnley. And this reminds me of a story I heard a few years ago. I sometimes teach writing courses. And there was a story going around about a writing teacher who gave an assignment to his students. He said, all right, I want you to write a short story about these 4 themes in it. I want royalty, I want, how did this go? I want religion, I want royalty, I want sex, and I want mystery. And the student handed in a story very, very quickly, which I will now recite to you in its entirety. Oh, Lord, cried the Queen, I am with child. I wonder who done it. Okay, go, Mary. Yes. She went off to England, thinking to throw herself in the mercy of Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth was not amused. And she kept her in prison for many years and finally had her executed. And that was the end of that. I'm running out of time here, and we're not getting to the really exciting one. Marie Antoinette. Good heavens. Marie Antoinette, born in Austria, the 15th of 16 children. At least her mother, the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa, understood about having large families, and she had a slogan. She said, other nations make war, fortunate Austria makes marriages. And so she was sent off to marry the Dauphin in France. But not before she'd had a complete makeover. Picture orthodontia in the 18th century. When you just kind of move your teeth around at will. Had her hair redone, taught her French, taught her to dance, sent her off to marry a guy who was not interested in sex at all. Not at all. He kept saying, well, you know, maybe when I'm older. He was already 18. Now, I don't know, when I was a young girl, my mother used to warn me about Frenchmen. All they ever think about is sex. Well, I never really tested her theory, but that certainly wasn't, that was certainly not true then. I'm out of time. We know what happened to her. Let me show you one more. I bet you wouldn't have recognized that one. Victoria, does that fit your idea of Queen Victoria? You know, the photograph of her as a dour old widow. At one time, that's what she was like. And she, too, had a very fascinating childhood. Another one who had to survive and finally get her place in the throne. My point in all of this is, if kids have an idea of history, and they really get engaged in it, through the characters that I've been describing to you, they'll pick up a lot of the background of it. They may not learn the Articles of Confederation or the treaties or the generals, but they'll get an idea of history, and that's where the leaders come from. Thank you.